Some heroes wear uniforms, others carry weapons. But in room 204 of Norris Hall at Virginia Tech, a 76-year-old engineering professor became a human barricade, pressing his slight frame against a classroom door while gunfire thundered through the corridor. Liviu Librescu had survived the Holocaust as a child, endured decades of communist oppression, and built a distinguished career studying the mechanics of materials under stress. Now he would learn the ultimate lesson about breaking points. Behind him, students frantically opened windows and jumped to the grass below, escaping death one by one. Before him, a gunman tried to force entry into the room, seeking more victims for a massacre already underway. Between them stood a professor who had spent his life calculating how structures fail under pressure. He held the door with his body, buying seconds that became lifetimes. The door shuddered with each impact. Librescu did not move. This was his final examination, and failure meant death for the young people he had dedicated his life to teaching. Liviu Librescu entered the world on the 18th of August, 1930, in Ploiești, Romania, a city known for its oil refineries and its Jewish community. His parents were educated, cultured Jews who believed in assimilation and progress. They gave their son a good home, emphasized education, and hoped the rising tide of anti-Semitism sweeping Europe would somehow pass over Romania. It did not. Librescu's childhood dissolved into fear as fascist movements gained power throughout Romania during the 1930s. The Iron Guard, a violently anti-Semitic organization, carried out pogroms and political assassinations. Jewish families watched nervously as neighbors who had once been friendly grew distant or hostile. By the time Librescu was 10 years old, Romania had aligned itself with Nazi Germany, and Jews faced systematic persecution under the Antonescu regime. In 1941, Romanian authorities began deporting Jews to labor camps and ghettos. The Librescu family was sent to a camp in Transnistria, a region between the Dniester and Bug rivers that Romania had occupied. Conditions were brutal. Inmates faced starvation, disease, forced labor, and random violence. Children watched their relatives die from typhus, malnutrition, and execution. Librescu, barely into his teens, learned lessons about human cruelty and survival that no child should ever have to absorb. The family survived through a combination of luck, resilience, and the occasional mercy of camp officials who could be bribed or reasoned with. Many of their relatives were not as fortunate. The Holocaust claimed extended family members, friends, and entire communities that Librescu had known. The boy who had once enjoyed a comfortable middle-class childhood now understood intimately that civilized society could collapse into barbarism with terrifying speed. Liberation came in 1944 as Soviet forces pushed through Romania, and the camps were abandoned. The Librescu family returned to Ploiești to find their former life destroyed. Property had been confiscated, businesses shuttered, homes occupied by others. The Jewish community had been decimated. Survivors gathered to count their losses, and somehow begin rebuilding lives from ruins. Librescu emerged from the Holocaust physically intact but fundamentally changed. He had seen how quickly normalcy could transform into nightmare, how easily neighbors could become persecutors, and how fragile the structures of civilization were. These lessons would shape everything that followed. He had survived when survival required endurance. He would spend the rest of his life proving that his survival meant something, that the boy who had lived through humanity's darkest chapter could contribute light to the world. Romania's liberation from fascism brought a new form of oppression. The Soviet Union installed a communist government that proved only marginally less hostile to Jews than the fascists had been. Official anti-Semitism was replaced by unofficial discrimination. Jews could no longer be openly persecuted, but they faced systematic barriers to advancement, constant surveillance, and pressure to abandon their religious identity. Librescu channeled his intelligence into education, the one avenue that offered some hope of advancement, despite political obstacles. He attended the Polytechnic University of Bucharest, demonstrating exceptional aptitude for mathematics and engineering. His mind found natural expression in aeronautical engineering and mechanics, fields that combined theoretical elegance with practical application. He completed his undergraduate degree, then pursued graduate studies, earning a doctorate in aerospace engineering, despite facing discrimination at every level. His research focused on aeroelasticity, the study of how aerodynamic forces interact with structural flexibility in aircraft. This specialized field required sophisticated mathematical modeling and deep understanding of material properties. Librescu's work gained recognition within Romania's technical community and eventually internationally, though his ability to travel and present his findings was severely restricted by the communist regime. The Romanian government maintained tight control over its intellectuals, viewing them as potential security risks or dissidents. Jews particularly faced scrutiny from the Securitate, Romania's secret police. Librescu lived under constant surveillance. His phone was tapped, his mail opened, his movements monitored. He learned to speak carefully, avoid political discussions, and never express criticism of the regime. Despite these obstacles, Librescu built a distinguished career within Romania's aerospace industry and academia. He published papers in technical journals, contributed to aircraft design projects, and taught at Romanian universities. His work on composite materials and structural mechanics placed him among the leading researchers in his field. International colleagues recognized his brilliance, but the Iron Curtain limited his ability to fully participate in the global scientific community. The greatest frustration came from being trapped. Librescu applied repeatedly for permission to emigrate to Israel, the Jewish homeland he dreamed of reaching. Each application was denied. The Romanian government, like other communist states, restricted emigration as a matter of policy. Allowing citizens to leave was seen as an admission that life under communism was inadequate. Jews who sought to leave faced particular hostility, accused of divided loyalties or Zionist plots. For nearly 3 decades after the Holocaust, Librescu remained in Romania, professionally accomplished but politically imprisoned. He married Marlena, built a family, published research, and waited for freedom that seemed unlikely to ever arrive. His life demonstrated a different form of courage than his childhood survival had required. This was the courage of persistence, of maintaining dignity and purpose, while living under a system designed to break the human spirit. The breakthrough came through international pressure. Throughout the 1970s, Western governments and human rights organizations increasingly criticized Romania's emigration policies. The United States linked trade benefits to improvements in human rights, including allowing Jews to emigrate. Romania's dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, pragmatic about maintaining Western economic relationships, grudgingly began permitting some emigration. In 1978, after years of applications and denials, the Librescu family finally received permission to leave Romania. The decision came suddenly. After decades of waiting, they could go to Israel. The relief was overwhelming, tempered by the knowledge that they would leave behind everything familiar, start over in middle age, and never return to the country of their birth. The family arrived in Israel in 1978, and for Librescu, now 48 years old, it felt like awakening from a long nightmare. For the first time since childhood, he lived in a country where being Jewish was not a handicap, but the national identity. No more surveillance, no more discrimination, no more suppressing part of his identity to survive in a hostile system. The freedom was intoxicating and disorienting. Tel Aviv University welcomed him as a faculty member in the Department of Solid Mechanics, Structures and Systems. His reputation as a researcher had preceded him, and Israeli academia valued the expertise he brought from decades of work under difficult conditions. Librescu threw himself into teaching and research with renewed energy. He could finally collaborate freely with international colleagues, travel to conferences, and pursue his work without political interference. His teaching style evolved during these years. Students found him demanding but deeply committed to their success. He set high standards, refused to accept mediocre work, and pushed students to achieve more than they thought possible. But beneath the strictness was genuine care. Librescu remembered his own struggle to get education under oppressive conditions and was determined to help students make the most of their opportunities. The Israeli years were professionally fulfilling, but also marked by practical challenges. Starting over financially in middle age was difficult. Librescu and Marlena worked to establish stability while raising their son. The adjustment to a new country, new language nuances, and new academic culture required flexibility and resilience. Still, these were fundamentally happy years. Librescu could worship openly, connect with the global Jewish community, and live without fear of arbitrary persecution. His research productivity increased. His reputation grew. International recognition that had been limited by the Iron Curtain now expanded as he published freely and collaborated with researchers worldwide. The boy who had survived the Holocaust and the man who had endured communist oppression was finally free to fulfill his potential without systematic barriers blocking his path. In 1985, Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, known as Virginia Tech, invited Librescu to join the faculty as a visiting professor in the Department of Engineering Science and Mechanics. The opportunity to work at a major American research university was too significant to decline. Librescu accepted, beginning what would become a permanent appointment that lasted over 2 decades. Blacksburg, Virginia, could hardly have been more different from Ploiești, or Tel Aviv. A small college town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, it offered quiet streets, southern hospitality, and one of the nation's leading engineering programs. Librescu adapted to American academic culture while maintaining his exacting European standards. His colleagues found him brilliant, occasionally difficult, and utterly dedicated to engineering education. His teaching reputation preceded him. Students learned quickly that Professor Librescu's classes demanded serious commitment. He assigned challenging problem sets, expected rigorous analysis, and had little patience for students who approached engineering casually. His exams were legendary for their difficulty. Grade distributions in his courses skewed lower than in many other classes. Yet students who met his standards emerged with deeper understanding and greater confidence in their abilities. Beneath the demanding exterior was a professor who genuinely cared about student success. Librescu held extensive office hours, patiently explaining concepts to students who struggled. He wrote detailed comments on assignments, pointing out not just errors, but ways to improve thinking and approach. Former students later recalled that, while his classes were among the hardest they took, they were also among the most valuable. His research continued to advance the field of aerospace engineering. Librescu published extensively on composite materials, structural dynamics, and aeroelasticity. His work contributed to understanding how modern aircraft structures behave under complex loading conditions. International journals regularly featured his papers. Graduate students sought to work with him despite, or perhaps because of, his reputation for rigor. Life in Blacksburg settled into comfortable routines. Librescu and Marlena lived modestly, focused on work and family rather than material accumulation. Colleagues knew him as the professor who arrived early, stayed late, and could often be found in his office on weekends. He took morning walks around campus, attended department seminars, and maintained connections with researchers worldwide. On the 15th of April 2007, Librescu celebrated his 76th birthday. By most measures, he had lived a full and successful life. He had survived the Holocaust, escaped communist oppression, built a distinguished academic career, and contributed significantly to human knowledge. Retirement was approaching. He could look back with satisfaction on decades of teaching and research. He had overcome extraordinary obstacles and proved that one person's dedication to learning and teaching could make lasting contributions. He had no way of knowing that the next morning would present a final test, one that would reveal the full measure of his character and the ultimate price of his courage. Monday morning at Virginia Tech began with tragedy that went unrecognized as a harbinger of greater horror to come. At 7:15 a.m. in West Ambler Johnston Hall, a student named Sung Hui Cho shot and killed 2 people. Campus police responded, treating the incident as a domestic dispute gone violent, a contained tragedy rather than the opening act of a massacre. The university administration made a fateful decision rather than lock down the campus immediately. Officials sent an email warning about the shooting, but allowed classes to proceed. Students and faculty arriving for morning classes had incomplete information about the danger. Many learned of the earlier shooting only vaguely, if at all, assuming the situation had been contained. Librescu arrived at his office in Norris Hall, a classroom building that housed much of the engineering program. At 76, he maintained the habits of a lifetime, arriving early to prepare for his 9 a.m. solid mechanics class. He reviewed lesson materials, perhaps thought about the problem sets he would assign, and prepared to spend another morning teaching the mathematical principles governing how structures respond to stress. His students filtered into room 204 on the second floor. It was an ordinary Monday morning class, about 24 students settling into seats, pulling out notebooks, checking phones before the lesson began. Some were tired from weekend activities, others alert and engaged. None had any reason to suspect this morning would be different from countless others. The class began at 9 a.m. Librescu lectured, worked through equations on the board, fielded questions from students. Engineering mechanics was his life's work, the mathematical language he spoke with fluency and precision. For 40 minutes, the class proceeded normally. Students took notes, worked through example problems, engaged with material that would prepare them for careers designing aircraft, bridges, and other structures. At 9:40 a.m., the sound of gunfire shattered the academic routine. Cho had entered Norris Hall, chained the main entrance doors shut from the inside, and begun systematically moving through classrooms, shooting students and faculty. The sounds were unmistakable, loud reports echoing through hallways, screams, chaos erupting in a building that moments before had been dedicated to quiet learning. Librescu and his students heard the gunfire in seconds. Normal life dissolved into crisis. The professor who had spent the morning discussing equations now faced calculations of an entirely different nature. How long until the shooter reached their classroom? Could the door be secured? Was there time to escape? His mind, trained for decades to analyze problems and find solutions under pressure, engaged with terrible clarity. The lesson plan was abandoned. Survival became the only curriculum that mattered. Cho moved through Norris Hall with methodical violence, forcing his way into classrooms and shooting everyone he could find. He carried 2 handguns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. His actions were deliberate, systematic. He sought maximum casualties. The chained entrance doors prevented easy escape or intervention. Students and faculty were trapped inside with an active shooter. In room 204, Librescu made an instantaneous decision. The windows offered a potential escape route. The classroom was on the second floor, high enough to cause injury from a jump, but not impossible to survive. Students could get out through the windows if given time. But the door, the only other exit, had no lock. Nothing prevented the shooter from simply pushing it open and killing everyone inside. Librescu moved to the door and braced his body against it. He became the lock, using his weight and strength to hold the door closed. He told his students to go to the windows, to open them and jump. His voice was calm, authoritative. This was not a suggestion. It was an order from a professor who expected to be obeyed. Students rushed to the windows. They opened them and looked down at grass 2 stories below. Some hesitated, weighing the certain injury of jumping against the uncertain threat in the hallway. The sound of gunfire clarified the calculation. They jumped, one after another. Students dropped from the windows, landing hard but alive on the ground below. Some suffered broken bones and sprains. All survived. Behind them, Librescu held the door. Cho arrived at room 204 and tried to push inside. The door moved slightly, but did not open. The professor's body provided resistance. Cho pushed harder. Librescu pushed back. This 76-year-old man who weighed perhaps 140 pounds became an immovable barrier protecting his students' escape. Cho fired through the door, bullets punched through the wood and found Librescu. The professor absorbed rounds meant for the students behind him. His body shuddered with each impact, but he did not move from the door. He held his position while the last students escaped through the windows. Only when the final student had jumped did Librescu's strength fail. He collapsed, his body blocking the door even in death. Cho forced his way into the room. He found it empty except for the fallen professor. The students had escaped. 5 young people who should have died that morning were running across campus, injured but alive. They lived because one man decided that holding a door mattered more than his own survival. The calculation had been simple for Librescu, his life against 5 others. The mathematics were clear. He had made his choice in seconds, and held his position until the last possible moment. The gunfire continued in other rooms. Cho methodically moved through Norris Hall, killing more students and faculty. The massacre would ultimately claim 32 lives, including the shooter himself. But in room 204, on the 16th of April 2007, a professor who had survived the Holocaust and communist oppression made his final stand, using his body as a shield and buying seconds that became the difference between life and death for 5 students he barely knew. When police finally breached the chained doors and entered Norris Hall, they found carnage beyond comprehension. Bodies lay in classrooms and hallways. Wounded students called for help. Cho had turned one of his guns on himself, ending his rampage with suicide. The building was a crime scene, a place of unspeakable violence that would haunt everyone who entered it. Emergency responders began the grim work of treating the wounded and documenting the dead. 32 people had been killed, including Professor Liviu Librescu. 17 others suffered serious injuries. The Virginia Tech shooting became the deadliest school massacre in American history, surpassing previous tragedies and raising urgent questions about campus security and gun violence. The students who escaped from room 204 told their stories to police and, eventually, to media. They described how Professor Librescu had held the door, ordering them to escape through windows. They explained how he had used his body as a barricade, absorbing bullets while they fled. Their survival was directly attributable to his sacrifice. Without his actions, all of them would likely have died. News of Librescu's death reached his wife Marlena at their Blacksburg home. The grief was compounded by the nature of his death. He had survived the Holocaust, endured decades of communist oppression, lived to see freedom and professional success, only to die protecting students from a gunman. The tragedy was cruel in its randomness and profound in its revelation of his character. He had died as he had lived, standing firm against evil, protecting those who depended on him. The campus descended into communal mourning. Candlelight vigils honored the victims. Students and faculty struggled to process trauma that would take years to work through. The broader community of Blacksburg, Virginia, rallied to support the university, providing comfort and resources to those affected by the shooting. The nation watched in horror, debating gun laws, mental health services, and campus security measures. Other acts of heroism emerged from the tragedy. Professor Jocelyn Couture Nowak was killed while trying to barricade her classroom door. Kevin Granata, another engineering professor, led students to safety before being shot while checking on others. Students barricaded doors with desks, helped wounded classmates escape, and provided first aid under fire. But Librescu's story carried particular resonance. His history as a Holocaust survivor, who died protecting others, created a narrative arc that captured international attention. Here was a man who had spent his childhood fleeing genocide, his adulthood escaping oppression, and his final moments preventing murder. His life became a testament to how one person's courage could span decades and continents, from Romanian labor camps to Israeli universities to a Virginia classroom where his last lesson was taught not through words, but through sacrifice. Memorial services for the Virginia Tech victims began within days of the shooting. The university held ceremonies honoring all 32 people killed. Each name was read, each life acknowledged. Librescu's memorial drew particular attention from international media and dignitaries. Israel's government honored him as a national hero, flying flags at half-mast and holding ceremonies recognizing his sacrifice. The man who had emigrated to Israel seeking freedom had died exemplifying the values the country represented. Romanian officials also claimed him, noting his birth in Romania and his years contributing to Romanian aerospace engineering despite facing discrimination. The irony was not lost on observers. The country that had imprisoned him in labor camps as a child and denied him permission to leave for decades now praised his heroism. Librescu had transcended national boundaries through his sacrifice, becoming a symbol of courage that different countries sought to honor. His students, the ones he had taught over 2 decades at Virginia Tech and earlier in Israel, shared memories that revealed the complexity of his character. He had been demanding, setting standards that seemed impossibly high. He had been strict, refusing to accept excuses or substandard work. But he had also been deeply invested in student success, spending countless hours and office hours helping those who struggled, writing detailed feedback on assignments, pushing students to achieve more than they believed possible. The 5 students who survived because Librescu held the door spoke publicly about their professor and his final actions. They described the calmness with which he ordered them to escape, the firmness of his command that brooked no argument. They talked about jumping from windows while hearing him hold the door against the shooter. They carried the knowledge that they lived because he died, a burden and a gift they would carry for the rest of their lives. Professional tributes honored his academic contributions. Librescu had published over 200 papers on aerospace engineering, structural mechanics, and composite materials. His research on aeroelasticity advanced understanding of how aircraft structures behave under complex loading conditions. Graduate students had benefited from his mentorship, going on to careers in aerospace engineering, armed with the rigorous training he provided. His intellectual legacy extended far beyond that single morning in April. Colleagues at Virginia Tech remembered a man who had maintained old-world academic standards in an era of grade inflation and student satisfaction surveys. He had insisted on rigor, demanded excellence, and refused to compromise his principles. Some students had complained about his difficulty. Others had flourished under his demanding tutelage, all recognized after his death that his standards reflected how deeply he cared about education and student development. The engineering building where he died was eventually renamed. Scholarships were established in his honor. Students pursuing aerospace engineering could apply for funding that commemorated his dedication to the field. The university worked to ensure that Librescu's legacy extended beyond his final sacrifice to include his decades of teaching and research contributions. His widow, Marlena, became a guardian of his memory, giving occasional interviews and attending memorial services. She spoke about the private man behind the public hero, his love of learning, his dedication to family, his quiet humor. She shared that he had planned to retire soon, to travel and spend more time with grandchildren. Those plans died with him in room 204, replaced by a legacy that would endure far longer than any retirement could have provided. Liviu Librescu taught thousands of lessons across 76 years. He instructed students in structural mechanics, aerospace engineering, and rigorous analysis. But his final lesson transcended equations. It was about courage, sacrifice, and the instant recognition of evil by someone who had confronted it before. The boy who survived the Holocaust learned that civilization's veneer is thin and that survival requires extraordinary endurance. The man who persisted through communist oppression learned that dignity can survive even when freedom cannot. The professor who emigrated twice learned that home is wherever you contribute meaningfully to others. On the 16th of April 2007, those lessons converged. When gunfire echoed through Norris Hall, Librescu moved to the door without hesitation. He held it closed while students escaped, absorbing bullets meant for them. His choice required no deliberation. It was simply the culmination of everything his life had taught him about standing firm against evil, 5 students live today because he held a door. They graduated, started families, contributed to communities. Their children exist because one professor decided that his life mattered less than theirs. His legacy reaches beyond those 5 survivors to every student who learned from his demanding courses, every engineer who built on his research, everyone who heard his story and understood something essential about courage. Some heroes survive to receive recognition. Others become legends through sacrifice. Liviu Librescu's last lesson was his greatest, that courage is measured not by the absence of fear, but by the willingness to stand firm when standing matters most.